Lee Drutman, welcome to the Realignment.
Hey, it's great to be realigning with you all.
Good to see you, Lee.
This episode has been a long time coming. Our audience is obsessed with the idea of third parties. Many of them dislike Democrats, they dislike Republicans. So a frequent question we get is, when are we going to see a third party? Now, your book focusing on multi-party democracy, the two-party doom loop, is a little broader than just the third-party dynamic. So can you distinguish between what a multi-party democracy would look like and just the generic idea that we should have a Green Party or a Libertarian Party or Brett Weinstein's Unity 2024 to disrupt the duopoly?
All right. So I think it's actually helpful to start with the idea of a third party that's somehow going to disrupt the two-party system in the U.S. And the reason why we never get that third party that disrupts the duopoly in the U.S. is because we have a first-past-the-post, winner-take-all electoral system, which makes it very hard for third parties to compete because voters don't want to waste their votes. And they worry that a third party would be voting for a spoiler. And ambitious politicians and people with money want to pick a winner. And so they try to take over one of the two major parties. They try to influence one of the two major parties because the two major parties are the two major parties. It's a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy there. But it also is how plurality winner systems work. So, it's if there were one party that could be more popular than the other two parties, it would be one of the two major parties. But the electorate is not so evenly split that, there's a centrist party or a left party or a right party that would be more popular. The two major parties do a pretty good job of building these broad coalitions, although that's one of the reasons why they can't seem to get anything done, because their coalitions electorally are a little too broad to then agree on what they're actually going to do when they govern. Now, a multi-party system emerges out of more proportional voting rules, which involve multi-member districts and some proportional allocation formula. There are as many forms of proportional representation as there are democracies that use proportional representation. So it's sort of a broad family of electoral systems, and we can talk about different types of proportional representation. But the basic idea is that you represent parties in proportion to how popular they are in the electorate, and votes are not wasted if they're not for one of the two major parties as a result of having multiple members representing any given electoral districts, or in a few cases, the entire country is one giant electoral district.
So, Lee, what do you make of, I'm sure a lot of this was a question we got all the time about voting third party, like that entire debate. My friend Joe Rogan, he was like, I voted for Joe Jorgensen just as a protest because I wanted to make it known that I wasn't satisfied with both. What do you make of that dynamic? Because we faced it a lot here ahead of the election. And people were like, well, I think I'm going to vote libertarian because I oppose regime change wars. And it's like, okay, well, look, if that's the one thing you care about, you should probably vote for Trump. And if somebody's like, oh, well, I'm going to vote for the Green Party because I want more, I want the environment to do better and I don't trust Biden to do a good enough job. It's like, well, yeah, but when it's Biden versus Trump, you should probably vote for Joe Biden. So what do you make of that dynamic generally?
Well, in our two-party system with winner-take-all elections, a vote for a third party is generally going to be a wasted vote. Now, the history of third parties in America is that third parties actually have made some important differences by elevating issues that the two major parties were ignoring and forcing them to take those issues seriously. But we're in this rather unique moment in U.S. political history in which the parties are extremely polarized, in which U.S. politics is very nationalized, in which the person who controls the White House, the party that controls Congress, is extremely important and consequential. So under these conditions, it's really hard for somebody to say, well, I don't care who wins Trump or Biden. I don't care which party controls Congress. I'm just going to vote for a third party when that control of Congress is at stake. And when you know that voting for a third party is going to effectively be wasted. Now, there is, I think, certainly some value in still voting for a third party, because to the extent that if you believe that we ought to have more parties, the way to have more parties is to support electoral reform, some form of proportional representation. But the way to pressure the major parties into doing that is to make them fear that without doing that, they're going to lose voters to third or fourth or fifth parties. I mean, if you look at the conditions under which proportional representation has been adopted in many democracies, it's often in moments of uncertainty when major players, major parties are really uncertain about their political future. They feel threatened, and proportional representation is a way to is almost like a peace treaty to say, look, we're going to set rules that are fair for everyone, and then we'll all compete on fair terms rather than we'll have rules that push out the competition.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, if listeners don't have the exact picture of this, could you articulate how proportional representation exactly looks in different democracies? So maybe the United Kingdom, other places like that.
Well, this is a myth that United Kingdom is actually not a proportional democracy. It uses the same.
I just learned something.
Yeah. So it is a parliamentary democracy, and people often confuse parliamentary and proportional democracies.
So wait, let me test my knowledge. Is France proportional?
France is France is weird. Okay, France is. France uses a 2-round system, which so I would consider France more majoritarian than proportional because they use single winner districts. Because of the 2-round system, they wind up having it's quasi multi-party. I mean, the UK is extremely majoritarian. Canada is very majoritarian, also parliamentary. France is sort of a middle ground, and then they're sort of halfway between parliament and presidential. France is a kind of weird hybrid system.
So break down proportional then. Give us some examples.
So the purest form of proportional representation is probably the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, the entire country is one electoral district, and people vote for a party, and then the parties get representation in the parliament there. Based on the share of their votes. So in the Netherlands, there is a party for the animals. There's an animal rights party. There's a party for the seniors, a pensioners party. There's 13 parties in the parliament. Now the Dutch seem to do okay with it. Israel has the same system, which is sometimes people say, oh, you want us to become Israel. Israel has its own set of problems, and we can talk about the way proportional representation works in Israel. But I think the general assessment among electoral scholars is that probably that level of proportionality is a little bit too much. That you want to find a balance between having a diversity of parties, but not so much fracture. So that's the Netherlands is kind of an extreme example. So the systems that scholars of democracy who study electoral systems tend to like there's basically probably three kinds. One which I like is what the Irish use, which is they have multi-member districts, so 3 to 5 members per district for their parliament, and they use ranked choice voting there. So you vote for multiple candidates, you rank them, and then for any given district, the top 5 finishers after transfers go to parliament. And the Irish typically have about 3 to 5 parties. It's been a consistently pretty functional democracy. And, I think the systems of ranked choice voting or vote pooling, as sometimes people would call it in the comparative international electoral system space, it's good for countries that are diverse, that are trying to build coalitions across different racial groups. Another system that is seen as to be pretty effective and fair is what Germany and New Zealand both use, which is a system called mixed member proportional, in which you get 2 votes, 1 vote for a representative from your district, and another for a party, and the share of seats in the legislature corresponds to the party vote, but you also get a constituent representative. So that is a nice blend between having somebody who represents your district and a fair share of votes for all parties. And I think we would say that New Zealand and Germany are both doing pretty well as democracies. Interesting on New Zealand is that was a relatively recent innovation. They voted on that in the 90s after an extreme period of dysfunctional politics in which trust in political institutions in New Zealand were extremely low.
So that's really interesting. I mean, the way I'm kind of surveying the system right now is we've got all-time trust, low trust in institutions and the media. I mean, this basically we refer to in terms of the doom loop. And if there was ever going to be a time, I mean, maybe it would be now, although I still think it's incredibly unlikely. I want to mull something over with you. I'm basically thinking that the Republican Party, as it currently stands, and listeners will have heard me say this before, is really in big trouble, because I think they have 2 kind of irreconcilable wings. One of which is like 15 to 20% of the upwardly mobile, kind of suburban white, normal coalition that was normal to George W. Bush and to Mitt Romney. These people are very sick of Trump. They disapprove of Stop the Steal and all that. At the same time, Trump is tremendously popular in 68 to 70% of the Republican Party. That includes like the QAnon wing and more. And so you have this situation where, especially impeachment. I mean, as you and I are talking, I see an article come across my screen about Mitch McConnell, like privately wants Trump to be gone. He wants to vote in order to convict him. I mean, that would be, I think, one of those cleavage moments of the 15 to 20% of that party away, and then 68% becomes increasingly minority. In times of like crisis like this, where, look, even the Democrats, with all this going on, they might be slightly larger than these, 2 kind of factions, but they're not like an all-out majority party. Why is all of this bad for democracy? And it kind of refers to the doom loop, as you're saying. I'm curious if you agree with that kind of coalitional analysis.
Yeah, I think your coalitional analysis is correct. So why is this bad for democracy? I mean, I think it's bad for democracy because we have 2 parties, and one of the 2 major parties is increasingly being taken over by just a sort of radical, extreme anti-system movement, which, I mean, there are some genuine concerns powering that, and some just outright racist concerns powering that, but it's congealed into this wild conspiracy supporting movement that is basically of the view that elections that they don't win are illegitimate, and it doesn't fit in the sort of realm of normal democracy parties. Now, in any given system, there might be, a 15 to 20% of the electorate that has these extreme anti-system views in a particular moment of economic transition or demographic transition, as is happening in some Western European countries, but they're not one of the 2 major parties. They're not a party that has a chance to win control of government. And democracy basically depends on the major parties understanding that there is a process by which we decide who is in power, and that process is legitimate, fair, equal to all sides. And that's the foundation of democracy. Democracy relies on a shared sense that there are basic rules that we all agree on, that they are fair, they are legitimate, and we are going to acknowledge the results of those of elections around those rules. And what we have lost in the United States at this moment is that shared sense on which democracy depends, that shared sense of elections as legitimate. And in one famous definition of democracy, democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. And the Republican Party is, as you said, the dominant share of the Republican Party is a party that does not abide by the basic shared agreement of democracy. And that is extremely, extremely dangerous. And we're already seeing how it's destabilizing. And just because of the nature of binary political conflict with a lot of people who don't feel like the Democrats really represent them either, it's quite possible that Republicans could win back unified control of government by 2025 with an extreme anti-system wing of the party dominant.
I'm interested in your earlier point because this relates to the debate about the Republican Party, especially during and after Trump, around oftentimes third parties could elevate issues that the established parties aren't engaging with. And you referenced the bad things, racism, etc. But you mentioned there were some good things. I want to actually get into those good things. What are the issues that you think either a left-leaning or a right-leaning third party could elevate under the current system? Like what's missing from the policy portfolio? What's missing from the menu that they're under a less polarized version of American politics you'd see raised?
Well, I think there are a number of issues where we would be devoting a lot more attention to the topic. I think climate is probably the most important of those issues. I think the economic changes that technology have driven and the inequalities of the economy that both within cities and across the density divide, I think we would be talking a lot more about those. I think immigration would still be an extremely contentious issue because it always is. But I think at least climate and the sort of economic consequences of technology, we would be dealing with more productively.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating to that point because I think back to, the last successful third party moment I guess was Ross Perot. One of the high water marks really of third party in the modern political era, and he got a significant chunk of the vote. I mean, what did he get? Like 20% or something like that?
Yeah, I think 19%, but yeah.
Right. And if you think back to it, you're like, wow, okay, 19% for an anti-globalization, anti-trade message. I mean, a lot of those voters probably sat out elections or were inspired by more of a Trumpian message. And so in a way, kind of speaks to what you're saying, which is that third parties can elevate certain concerns that people are feeling left out of the system. I guess one of the things I want to return to, though, is you talked originally here about one of the problems of the two-party duopoly, which we both completely agree with, is around the people who are in charge. How much do you think that the current establishment benefits from the two-party system? Because as you said, there are people who are making a lot of money or use a lot of money in order to keep the architecture of the current strict structures of both the Republican and the Democratic Party together. What role do you think that plays? Kind of like a, more establishment control of both sides. And we'll get into whether that's even effective in a bit.
Yeah. Well, I want to go back to Ross Perot because there are a few important points to make about Ross Perot's candidacy as you talk about being kind of an anti-globalization, as well as about the deficit. Perot is successful for a third party candidate in 1992 precisely because I think a lot of voters feel like Bush, Clinton, like what difference does it make, right? So if I don't see much of a difference between the two major parties, I can vote for a candidate who's kind of an anti-system candidate. It's kind of a little bit of a middle finger to the sort of, establishment in Washington. And, also to the fact that Perot was raising concerns about globalization that both of the two major parties dismissed. There was sort of this neoliberal consensus around the importance of global trade. So, that to the point that third parties often raise concerns that if the powers that be in Washington had took concerns about globalization and its and the sort of distributive effects of free trade on the economy, as was raised by Ralph Nader and Pat Buchanan as well, but those third parties were dismissed as spoilers. And so nobody took their concerns that seriously. Turns out that they actually had an important warning about the consequences of unmitigated free trade. That if we had taken if we had more parties and there had been more of a threat to the major parties, they probably would have adopted and adapted sooner. So to the point about the establishment, does the establishment benefit? I mean, at this point, I'm not even sure who the establishment is. I mean, I feel like they're things are in flux, and I think you could sort of say that there's sort of an establishment wing of the Democratic Party that's maybe a little bit cozier with business and a little bit more upper class. You could say that there's sort of an establishment wing of the Republican Party that's a little bit more classic country club Republican. And they've certainly benefited economically for quite a while now. Do they benefit from the two-party system? I don't know. I mean, they benefit from the sort of status quo and gridlock of politics, right. But I think they're also threatened in the same way by instability. I mean, I think the way to think about that is, that I think a lot of folks in the quote unquote establishment are in fact, extremely worried about the sort of wild swings in policy that come from this intense polarization.
Yeah. But that being said, to build on this, the thing is, Sagar, I'm thinking about your establishment construct. There are plenty of quote unquote members of the establishment who would like a less polarized national politics two-party system. Think of something like Larry Hogan. The reason why Larry Hogan, governor of Maryland, and Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, the reason why they have no political future outside of their states is because there is no, frankly, national party that represents their actual ideology, which is socially liberal, relatively fiscal conservative, and just moderate on those actually policy approaches. Look at Meg Whitman, who, former CEO of Quibi, rest in peace. But before that, she was in charge of Hewlett-Packard and ran for governor of California. Arnold Schwarzenegger also fits into that category as well, too. These are people who, if there was a more country club Republican establishment party that reflected their politics, they would actually be much more likely to succeed on the national stage. So I do think there are many ways that the members of the establishment outside of the DC Beltway probably don't like the system. Same thing is true for Southern Democrats. If Doug Jones was able to run in the South, in Alabama, in a less polarized state, it'd be totally different. But yeah, Lee, what do you think about that overall picture?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And, one of the things that I argue in my Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop book is that we used to have something much more like that four-party system with Larry Hogan, Charlie Baker as, the liberal Republican Party. Probably George H.W. Bush was kind of the last president from that wing of the party, but a long storied tradition of New England Republicans who were liberal, who were quite different from the kind of Western, very conservative Republicans, even though they shared a party. And similarly, you had liberal Democrats alongside the conservative Southern Democrats. So in that four-party system, you had a much much broader diversity of perspectives, but you also had a lot of overlapping factions. So this was a very different political system in which members of Congress could work together in this sort of cross-partisan way and actually work out compromises on pretty important legislation. And, it ensured that, regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans were in power, that different parts of the country, and both country and city, were going to have at least some sense that they had a role to play in the existing government. And now what's happened is that you have one party that is, the party of cities and sort of professional class suburbs, and another party that's the party of the exurbs and sort of the downwardly mobile suburbs, and an education divide, a geographic divide, a cultural divide. Whereas whichever party is in power, about half of the country feels like, this is not a party that represents anybody like me. And that raises the stakes, it raises the polarization, and creates ultimately, tremendous instability in our political system, which, whoever you are, is probably not something that you want to see happen.
There's a semi-ironic contradiction to this entire discussion. So we're talking about how there's this duopoly, both parties, they're getting more and more impenetrable to third party and independent runs. Yet at the same time, you mentioned this on Ezra Klein's podcast that you released around this launch of the book, the parties themselves are weaker than ever, as in the Democratic National Committee doesn't actually disperse large amounts of money. It's not as if the platforms themselves really even matter. You go back to the 50s and 60s, the decisions over what the parties will represent at the National Convention was a big deal there. So as we're seeing more and more diffusion of power away from the actual political parties, we're still seeing this lack of representation problem happening. So I want you to just speak to that, because for context, we recently had a woman named Swati Milavarapu on. She was Pete Buttigieg's national finance chair out of Silicon Valley, and she talked about how she raises money for candidates. She has a actual training cohort that she puts together. She's filling all of the functions of what the Democratic Party used to fulfill. In an earlier time, she would have run to be head of the DNC, but she isn't doing that because he wants to be head of the DNC. The worst thing for Pete Buttigieg's career would have been if he'd actually won his DNC chair race in 2016. What a disaster for him if that had been true. So can you just speak to the fact that people hate these parties? They have so much power, but they also don't have that much power. Right?
Yeah, it is a great paradox. Because on the one hand, they're the structuring force of our politics. On the other hand, when you poke at them and you try to see what's there, they're kind of ethereal. So, I think one way to understand it is that the parties are coalitions. They're networks. Maybe you could even think of them as blobs, as as one political science paper argues. But in order to hold together, they have to be kind of amorphous. Because once the party leaders, which is the leaders in Congress, the president, other public figures, take strong stands on too many issues, that's going to create division in the party. So in many ways, the goal of party leadership is to avoid the issues that will divide the party and focus on the issues that will unify the party. And what are the issues that unify the party? Well, we're not the other guys. Now, if you watched the Republican National Convention, you would have learned that the Democrats are a fundamental threat to America. But you wouldn't have learned much about what the Republican Party was actually going to do with power, other than keep the liberals out of power. If you watch the Democratic Convention the week before, you would have learned that the Republican Party is a threat to democracy, and the Democratic Party has, lots of people who speak in broad principles, but you wouldn't have really gotten a sense of what the Democratic Party was going to do either. Now, there's a reason that both parties focus on the threat of the other party, is because nothing unites like a common enemy. But there's a weakness in that, because the parties can't agree on anything except that they're not the other side. So politics is all about demonizing the other side. And then when the parties get into power, they have to figure out what they actually are going to do with it. Yeah. Look at the Democratic Party is like shocked that it actually has a trifecta now. And, Biden's been preparing a lot of executive actions, and there's, maybe Democrats are out of the gate with HR 1S1, which I think is an important democracy reform bill. But it's not clear what their plan is going to be on.
And what's that bill, by the way?
The HR 1S1, the For the People Act. It's a big democracy reform bill that deals with independent redistricting,
Right.
protecting and expanding the right to vote, transparency in campaign finance, and some public funding for campaign finance.
Here's one problem though we have, Lee. As you're describing this, I'm like, yeah, this is hellish. Here's the problem. Trump won more votes than he won last time by doing that. And Biden just won more votes than any presidential candidate in history. So Trump, by being Trump and just being like, screw the libs, actually won 75 million votes. And Biden, by basically saying, screw Trump, won 81 millions. That's a lot of votes. So it actually got more people more democratically engaged than ever. So how do you actually self-exit this system when people like it? I mean, let's be honest,
Reveal preferences.
It's for real. I was driving through this rural Nevada, and I saw this sign. It's just Trump, F your feelings. And I was like, that's it. That's what it's all about. That's the whole thing. And then it was the same thing, around my neighbor. We live in DC, and it's just all these bye Don, and this he's orange, and thank you, Dr. Fauci. And I'm like, that's it. That's the soul of the. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but this is what gets people going. So it's if we want to self-exit, what are we going to do here?
Negative partisanship. Nothing mobilizes and motivates people like anger.
Yeah.
But, I don't know, if you ask all these people who have the Biden, or I also saw Any Functioning Adult 2020.
Yes, I've seen it all.
Seen a few of those too. Right. I don't think people would say that they enjoy this. The level of anxiety that people feel is not, yes, people are voting at a higher rate, but people are not voting out of enthusiasm and joy. They're voting out of fear and anxiety, and anger, which are all powerful motivators. I would rather have a democracy where fewer people vote, and we get better public policy. If that were a trade-off.
So this is where I have to speak up for our 2 to 3 MSNBC watching liberal viewers, if you are out there. What they are going to say is that, Lee, your argument basically boils down to a mix of light whataboutism and light just sort of both-siderism, in the sense that the peril we face right now is you have a Republican Party that is launching an insurrection, and all this talk about multi-member districts, all this talk of reform should just come down to basically 3 things. Let DC into the US, make DC a state, make Puerto Rico a state, pass a national popular vote so Republicans can't win the way Donald Trump won in 2016 again. Those are the big things. Because at the end of the day, this person would argue that the problem we face isn't that we don't have enough parties and enough views represented. They would just say we have a party that believes in a majoritarian rule in this country and one that doesn't. And those are the reforms we should focus on, not multi-party democracy. And towards the start of your book, and credit to our amazing intern Emma for pointing out this point, your rebuttal to everything I just said was basically, if you pursue that path, it could result in an electoral disaster. Here's the thing, though. In Georgia, Republicans made that argument and Democrats won anyways. So now that Democrats have power, if I'm thinking ruthlessly, if I'm a Democrat thinking, look, Mitch McConnell just replaced RBG after promising not to, screw it. Let's just do it. We're going to suffer electorally in 2022, maybe, but this is a death sport. So what do you say to this broad articulation?
So, I mean, look, I agree that, I would support.
This was not fair, by the way. I'm just throwing this at you.
for DC, I mean, I think the Puerto Rico question is more complicated than, a typical cheerleading MSNBC viewer would want to wrestle with. I mean, look, the HR 1 package of democracy reforms make it easier to vote. I mean, all of that seems like no-brainers, like baseline democracy, stuff. But, is that going to give Democrats, a permanent majority? Like, probably not. It's a pattern that, with very few exceptions, the party that controls the White House loses elections in the midterms. Even with Donald Trump as the Republican candidate, Republicans picked up seats in the House, held on to more seats in the Senate, held on to a bunch of state legislatures. Donald Trump got 74 million votes. So the Republican Party is going to continue to be competitive. And, to the extent that Democrats, push, major democracy reform, I mean, yes, I think that's important. But, Republicans will, probably try to escalate back. But I mean, I think a broader question, and this takes us into the territory a little bit of democratic theory, is whether we want to have a simple majoritarian view of democracy. Or whether we want something that I would consider to be more of a complex majoritarianism, which is, I think, more consistent with our institutions, which, if we want to go back to Madison and have a discussion about political philosophy, which I could go on for hours about, but, there's the idea that what makes democracy stable is that you have fluid coalitions. And there's, their allies become enemies, enemies become allies. There's no permanent majority, no permanent minority. And, the simple majoritarian view that Democrats should just beat the crap out of Republicans, like, okay, and then what? I mean, I think all these cries about 74 million people being ignored, they're the true people, whatever, it's a little bit of posturing, but at the same time, like, okay, so what happens if 74 or 70 million people, feel like they have no path to representation in our national institutions? That's bad also.
Exactly. No, I like that you said that. You're like, look, yes, there are like bad faith Republicans being like, 74 million spoke up and I'm going to object to Pennsylvania Electoral College law, even though I don't represent Pennsylvania, in order to carry that out, because apparently that makes sense. But look, it is true. 74 million people did vote for Trump. You do not want 74 million people to feel like they don't have a voice in our institutions. Here's the question, though, and this is the real problem that we've been confronting a lot here on this show. Does it really matter? Trump was in office, and I mean, he still got banned from Twitter, like he still got banned from Facebook. In terms of who rules non-governmental institutions in America, it ain't the right. And it ain't even remotely concerned with many of the 74 million who voted for Trump. As you said, if the Democratic Party is increasingly and upwardly mobile, urban slash suburban party, and then you've got a downwardly mobile, increasingly less educated one, then the highest institutions, the commanding heights of American cultural life, are just going to be dominated by two debates: progressive leftism and center leftism. Those are the only things that really matter. So I guess my question to you is not is it too far gone, but are we talking here about something that's just way different than politics? Because I don't see how, all these 74 million people, they had a voice in Washington, and it was basically just this like bumbling buffoon, Trump, who would speak, and he made them feel good because he pissed off a lot of people. But in terms of actually carrying something out in terms of policy, nothing really happened. And in many ways, liberal institutions are stronger today than they were when Trump took office in 2016.
So, I mean, what do you mean that nothing can?
What I'm asking is,
go on.
Yeah, what I'm asking is this: is this even a political party question? As in, now that we have institutions in American life, think tanks, Hollywood, finance, tech, etc., dominated by a worldview. Monopoly can't solve this. Politics can't solve this because these are non-governmental institutions. Does democracy and politics in America still give a voice to those people, even if they were to vote and to take power once again?
Sagar, let me add to give an example for the listeners, because I get where you're going. Does having a upper middle class suburban Republican Party and a Trumpy down market party make a difference if every other institution is dominated by some form of center left and progressive coalition? That's exactly that's what it's basically. So you could take the Republican Party and break it up into 5 different parties, and you could take the Democratic Party and break it up into another 5 parties. But under Sagar's framework, if we're looking at societal division, if we're looking at the lack of institutional trust, you would still have a reality that a specific ideology represented in different parties would still dominate. So you still would see the Larry Hogan and Charlie Baker party coalition with the operational center-left party. So that's the point of like, would this make a difference there?
Well, I mean, I think part of the challenge of so I mean, you could argue that I mean, Trump was a buffoon, but there was something in the 2016 version of Trumpism that spoke to the kind of left behind, downscale parts of the country, and that part of the reason why Trump was able to take those folks for granted and just not do anything on their behalf other than, scream at how liberals were too politically correct, is because those folks had nowhere else to go. And, that if you had a multi-party system and you have a lot of voters and, I don't know, maybe it's, I mean, there's, I think it's a challenging thing to sort of separate out what of Trump's coalition is just like purely like, racist people who genuinely like just want to, feel superior, and what part is, people who, are genuinely feel like their economic futures are going downhill, and they want so
sure.
And those two get kind of lumped together. So I think if you had a party or if you had multiple parties that were actually trying to compete for that slice of the electorate and offer some programs and some policies that actually were designed to help them rather than just channel their grievance, those folks would do better. Now, in the current system, that's not really possible because the Republican Party can just take them for granted, because where else are they going to go? Same way the Democratic Party can take a lot of their constituencies for granted because where else are they going to go? But in a multi-party system, the parties can't rely just on demonization of the other side. They have to actually distinguish themselves based on policy. If you look at like the Democratic primary, for example, which was kind of like a multi-party system and that there were multiple candidates, what happened is that the candidates didn't just take a crap on each other and say that the other side, the other candidates are all terrible. They said, here's my policy vision, and here's how it's different, and here's why you should vote for me.
This is so. Two questions are coming up here. The first one, and people are screaming at us for not asking you this: under your vision, did the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party, were they screwed over by the political establishment, by the DNC? Because something we just recurrently run into, and this is the problem of keeping unwieldy coalitions together. There's a large proportion of the Bernie Sanders base who thinks that the Democratic Party today either rigged primaries or is structurally against them. Like, what do you think about that critique or statement? We frankly don't agree with it, but I'm just curious, what your perspective is.
Well, look, I think there are, I don't see any evidence for it empirically, but I think there is a sense that, certainly the folks in the sort of Democratic Party, quote unquote, establishment, have not been particularly enthusiastic about Bernie's candidacy. There was, certainly a sense after the South Carolina primary that the establishment wing of the Democratic Party was coalescing around Biden. I think within the Democratic Party, there is, at least among Democratic Party elites, there is certainly a divide between the more progressive wing and the more quote unquote establishment wing. I think Biden's going to do the best he can to kind of straddle that as president. But certainly, as AOC said, if this were any other country, she and Joe Biden would be in different parties. And, I think if the social democratic left of the Democratic Party had the space and freedom to say, this is our vision of the American economy, and it's distinct from the moderate Democratic Party, and you can vote for either of us and we'll go to Congress in proportion to our share in the electorate, and you don't have to choose between one of us in a primary. We'd see a much more vibrant debate about these policies, as opposed to a debate that happens behind closed doors with party leaders saying, all right, you better all get online with whatever our candidate is, because otherwise Trump's going to win, or otherwise Republicans are going to win. And, that vibrant debate is essential to the deliberative process of democracy, and voters, ought to be able to choose between multiple parties and know what they actually stand for and be able to send a clear signal. To choose between just two options, you're sending a very noisy and unclear signal, because you don't know what voters are actually voting on. But you have 5 or 6 parties, and it becomes a little bit clearer, and politicians can respond.
Could you speak to how money and politics would work under the system? Because what's interesting about your package of reforms, you mentioned this, is none of this technically would require a constitutional amendment. A lot of this is decisions that Congress could make. But as we're thinking about how the mechanics of this party system would work, let's say you have the Country Club Republican Party. That party is firmly a party that corporate America and many big donors would firmly get behind. At the same time, though, the Trumpy Patriot Party, let's say it, would not be particularly able to raise money to the degree that the Country Club Republicans or the mainstream center-left party would be able to. So I'm guessing you would probably support some form of campaign finance reform. But how would that just operationally work? How would that look? Because if you really cut, because the thing about Trump is the deal with the devil that center right Republicans made with Trump was, look, we don't like your immigration stuff. We don't like Mexican rapists. But if you give us tax cuts, we'll keep the coffers open for 4 years. And if you do healthcare, try to get rid of Obamacare, that's basically it. But if you just get rid of the need for them to coalition together, they wouldn't pay the bills for the cultural conservatism or even the things that the good faith version of Trump person is interested in. So how would this all just work under that framework?
Well, I mean, I absolutely support campaign finance. There is a very good public funding small donor provision in HR1, which would match every $1 of small donor donations with $6 of public funding, which I think would be important. I think already, given the shift in fundraising to the internet, there has really been a small donor internet fundraising revolution. Bernie Sanders certainly raised a ton of money. So, I think, we should ensure that, parties across the political spectrum can raise money. I think one way to, one provision, in a sort of reform like this could be that, the parties themselves get public funding. And that's kind of how most European democracies operate, is that, the parties have a certain amount of funds to operate with so that they're competitive. I've worried about the corrosive role of money in politics for a long time. And, I think it's a perpetual problem. But I think giving voters more choices, and more than just two choices, it creates space for parties. Some parties might be funded by big dollar donations. Some parties might be funded by small dollar donations. And, that's, I'd like to see more small dollar donations and fewer large dollar donations. I'd like to see them, a different jurisprudence than we have around campaign finance. But that's, that's another issue.
It is to a certain point.
That's a whole other podcast. Last question for you, Lee, is how does this all work in your vision? Outline just like the general reforms that you would want to see, how you would want the system to look, and then how, maybe not how realistically it would get done, but if it were to get done, how would it get done?
Yeah. So, here's my proposal. For the House, I would have multi-member districts with ranked choice voting. I would eliminate House primaries entirely because they're not necessary under this system for people to have a voice. And I would increase the size of the House to 700 members. For the Senate, I'd put in place ranked choice voting, and with a 2-round. I like actually the Alaska model, which just is in place of a top 4 primary and then an RCV general election. I think is probably the best thing we can do for the Senate without a constitutional amendment. And I think if we combine those two, those would go a long way towards opening a multi-party system. How could that happen? I think it basically would happen if there's a more pronounced split in the Republican Party, and the sort of 10 or 15% of Republicans who are at odds with their party realize that they need this reform in order to survive and thrive, and the Democrats recognize that the greatest danger would be for the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party to not only take over the Republican Party but take total power, and that in the long run, this would be just a better, fairer system for everyone. And Democrats understand that the way in which the current electoral system works hurts them by disproportionately.
And to do all of this, Lee, do you need an act of Congress, constitutional amendment? Okay, all right.
No, you need an act of Congress. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution gives Congress pretty broad powers to determine the rules of its own election. It's a power that Congress has used repeatedly. No constitutional amendment would be required. If we want to talk about constitutional amendments, I could rattle off a long list of things I'd like to change about our Constitution, but that's a really high bar, especially in a deeply polarized time.
Well, Lee, thank you so much. This is really helpful. It's a pressing topic as everyone is demonstrating with their interest in ways we can change the system.
Yeah.
Yes,
thanks, Lee.
well-
really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thank you guys. And, this is certainly a time to be thinking big because what we have ain't working.
Well said.
Well said, man.